Shalom everyone, welcome back to a new video on our channel Jóvenes Peregrinando or Youth Pilgrims. My name is Jacqueline Luz and we are going to continue today with our series study of the Torah. And today's video is called Blessings and Prophecies for the Sons of Israel. And we will be reading chapters 48 and 49 of Genesis. In the previous chapter, or in our previous study, we saw how Joseph was finally reunited with his father after he revealed himself to his brothers. With the reunion, Joseph brought his family to live in the land of Egypt because of the famine that had spread to their home. Joseph presents his father and brothers before the Pharaoh, whom learns that they were sheep herders, so he gives them the land of Goshen to live in. We also see prophetically how Joseph is the one who not only brings the bread to the Israelites, but also to the Gentiles, or those of the nations. As the famine grew, we analyzed how the people began to even sell themselves to Pharaoh in order to receive food, a shadow of how the Messiah was going to bring the real bread that descends from the heavens, and everyone would become slaves of the Eternal, meaning they would become consecrated and obedient to his will, in order to receive the food that gives life. With this short review, we are going to continue with chapter 48. In verses 1 through 2, it says, after these things, someone told Joseph, someone told Joseph, behold, your father is sick. So he took his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, with him. When someone told Yaakov, saying, behold, your son Joseph has come to you, Israel summoned his strength and sat up in the bed. As we saw towards the end of chapter 47, Israel is already nearing his death, and he had made his son Joseph promise to bury him not in Egypt, but where his wife had laid. Now, in this chapter, it seems to be after that promise that Joseph visits his dad once again with his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Even though Israel was already old, he still showed interest in receiving his son as he summoned his strength to sit up and greet him. And this also shows that strong will he had to give him something special before he died. And we're going to see what it is. In verses 3 to 4, it says, then Yaakov said to Joseph, the Shaddai appeared to me in Luz, in the land of Canaan, and blessed me. He said to me, I am going to make you fruitful and multiply you and turn you into an assembly or into a congregation of peoples. And I will give you this land to your seed after you as an everlasting possession. So here's he talking about when he saw that dream with the ladder from which he saw Elohim's angels or his malachims descend and ascend on it. And when he was also given the promise from Elohim about the multiplication of his descendants. As we saw, he was going to be made into a congregation of peoples. And this is the promise that we know he had given as well to Abraham. And Luz, the place where he received this dream, was called by him Beth-El. And we can find all of this on chapter 28 of Genesis. Continuing from verses 5 to 7, it says, so now your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, they are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine, just like Reuben and Simeon. And a descendant of yours, whom your father after them will be yours. They will be identified by the names of their brothers for their inheritance. Now as for me, when I came from Padan, to my sorrow, Rachel died along the way, in the land of Canaan, while we were still a distance from entering Ephrath. And I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. So here we see how Yaakov then tells Joseph that his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, were going to become his sons. So he was going to adopt them. And they were going to be for him in the same way as his sons Reuben and Simeon. And any other sons that Joseph had afterwards would be his, and they would inherit the inheritance of Ephraim and Manasseh, that one that they were supposed to receive. Now we understand that this was something revealed to him, revealed to Yaakov by the Eternal, because he wasn't just speaking out of his flesh, but instead he was inspired by the Creator. And with the following verses, we're going to confirm why. It continues saying, then Israel saw Joseph's son and said, who are these? Joseph said to his father, they are my sons whom Elohim had given me here, or has given me here. Then he said, Please bring them to me, so I may bless them." Now Israel's eyes had grown heavy with old age. He could not see. So he brought them near to him, and he kissed them and hugged them. Then Israel said to Joseph, "To see your face I didn't expect. And look, Elohim has let me see your offspring as well." Then Joseph took them from his knees and bowed with his face down to the ground. Then Joseph took the two of them, Ephraim with his right hand across from Israel's left, and Manasseh from his left hand across from Israel's right, and brought them close to him. But Israel stretched out his right hand and placed it upon Ephraim's head, though he was the younger, and his left hand upon Manasseh's head, crossing his hands, though Manasseh was the firstborn. So here we see that Joseph brings closer his sons to Israel in order for them to receive the blessing, to pass down the inheritance as well to the firstborn, which in this case was Manasseh. As we know, this was already something done traditionally. We also saw this and experienced this with the past or the previous patriarchs. But what's interesting is that we continue seeing this pattern being repeated. For example, Abraham wasn't the oldest son, and yet he was the one chosen and received the promise. And then Yitzhak, he wasn't the firstborn was Ishmael, yet Ishmael wasn't accepted, and instead the promise carried on to Yitzhak. And then with Yaakov and Esav, we can say that physically, Esav was the one that was born first. He was considered to be the firstborn, which was why he was supposed to receive the inheritance based on the fact that he was firstborn before Yaakov. But we see that in reality, Yaakov was chosen as the firstborn, and he was given the actual inheritance and the blessing. So now we continue seeing this pattern here with Manasseh, who was the firstborn, but instead it's Ephraim who is receiving that blessing in order to continue receiving that promise that the Eternal had given through the patriarch Abraham. Although it's not specified or it's not actually described now that Manasseh wouldn't be the firstborn and instead it would be Ephraim, but what we see here is that the blessing that Ephraim is receiving as the firstborn is the same blessing that they have been receiving as among the patriarchs. And it was a blessing that would have passed on to Manasseh, but as we know, the father's will was different, and instead it went to Ephraim. And this is how we can confirm that the Eternal was actually guiding Yaakov to bless Joseph's son. At first, Yaakov begins talking to Joseph about how his two sons would no longer be his, but instead they would be the children of his father. They would be the children of Yaakov. But after he's done explaining to Joseph that he is taking them as his children because he had no more with his beloved wife Rachel, Yaakov seems to have suddenly realized that Ephraim and Manasseh were there. And he asks, "Who are they? Or who are these children? Or who are these people behind you?" It's important to note that these two boys were probably standing away from their grandfather. That is why he hadn't noted them. But then Yaakov asked Yosef to bring them closer so they could receive the blessing that had been passed down by the patriarchs. Another important detail is that Yaakov's sight was deteriorating due to age. And the reason why it's important to note this is because one would think that the most logical thing for him to do is to bless as he blessed his grandchildren, is to reach straight forward and give the blessing to each one. So just extend his arms above the heads of each one, straight forward, without actually crossing his arms like he had done it. But in this case, we see that Yaakov goes out of the way to twist his arms and bless Ephraim as the older one and Manasseh as the younger one. This was not a simple mistake. This was not something that maybe Yaakov was confused and he just twisted his arms in order to bless them. But it was the father who was guiding Yaakov to understand the prophetic importance in Yosef's children. Continuing on, we see that it says, "Then he blessed Joseph and said, 'The Elohim before whom my fathers Abraham and Yitzhak walked, the Elohim who has shepherded me throughout my life to this day, the angel or the messenger or the malach who redeemed me from all evil, may he bless the boys and may they be called by my name and by the name of my fathers Abraham and Yitzhak. May they multiply to a multitude in the midst of the land.'" When Joseph saw that his father placed his right hand upon Ephraim's head, it was wrong in his eyes. So he took hold of his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. So here we see that Yosef is realizing what is going on, and he wants to correct the situation, not knowing that this is actually what the father wants Yaakov to do. Yosef said to his father, "Not like that, my father, because this one's the firstborn. Put your right hand upon his head." But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know." So Yaakov knows who is the older one. He knows who is before him. And it says, and it continues saying, he also will become a people, and he also will become great. So Manasseh also has this promise that he will also have a multitude of descendants, not just Ephraim. But he continues saying, but his younger brother will become greater than he, and his seed will be the fullness of the nations. So here we see how Ephraim actually has this promise already with him, or that Yaakov has this understanding that it's through Ephraim that this is going to happen. It continues saying, then he blessed them the day, saying, and you shall Israel blessed by saying, may Elohim make you like Ephraim and like Manasseh. Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh. Then Israel said to Joseph, look, I am about to die, but Elohim will be with you and will bring you back to the land of your fathers. Now I myself give you one portion more than your brothers, that which I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and my bow. So here we see that Joseph is also receiving a blessing and an inheritance from Yaakov. Now, in this portion that we just read, I would like to focus on the name of Ephraim, because his name gives us a very deeper understanding as to why Yaakov was acknowledging him as the one who was going to bring that seed, the multiplication of that fruit. And the name of Ephraim, we could find it in Strong's Concordance in Hebrews 669, which means double fruit. And we see that the root for this word is Ephrath, I believe, from Hebrews 672, and this means fruitfulness. So double fruit and fruitfulness. We see that it has to do with that fruit, that multiplication, all those descendants as well. We understand that it represents that in this case, or in this scenario. And this word as well, Ephrath, has a root from Hebrews 600, 5009, para, which means to bear fruit, to bear, bring forth fruit, and to be fruitful, grow, increase. So this is what we see with Ephraim's name, and this is probably what Yaakov understood the moment he heard his name, that it was going to be through him that there was going to be this multiplication. So this was obviously because Yaakov was inspired by the Eternal. This is how he knew that Ephraim's name, or that Ephraim himself, was going to be the one who was going to fulfill the promise of the Eternal. That it was going to be fulfilled through him, the promise that he made to Abraham about becoming a large number of people. And since Yaakov wanted to give the blessing to Yosef, then it seemed reasonable for him that Ephraim was the means where they'd see that promise. Within the history of the people of Israel, we can see how the tribe of Ephraim actually becomes large in number. And we even see that they were the kingdom that, when the kingdom of Israel split into two kingdoms, the kingdom of the north and the kingdom of the south, the tribe of Ephraim becomes head of the north. Yet they were also the tribe that assimilated further on. We can see how this is also foreshadowed, as he was the son of an Egyptian, a land of Gentiles assimilated to paganism. It's important to remember that up until now, with the recent events surrounding Joseph's life, we have seen plenty of shadows about what was to come with the Messiah. The reunification of the 12 tribes and the bread of life that was given not only to the Israelites but also to the nations. It is not much different in this moment that we're analyzing right now. Even though Ephraim had assimilated, we can see how this tribe became part of the people that were dispersed within the nations and that needed to come back to the Eternal. Due to their deviation, they were far from the Father, as we see now with Ephraim when he was far from Yaakov. Yet they were brought close to the Father through Yeshua, our Messiah. This is what we see when Yaakov asks Yosef to bring his sons closer. And as we know, Yosef is also a shadow, or a shadow of what Yeshua was going to come and do. And as they are brought closer, they are given the promise, the blessings that the Eternal gave to Abraham and Isaac, and the promise to receive life and redemption through his Son. And thus we see how the Messiah came for the lost sheep of Israel, as we also see him say in Matthew 15, verse 24, when he responded, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel," talking about all of those that had been dispersed during the exile and that were still lost within the nations, assimilated, and that needed to be brought back to the Father so that they could receive the instruction and be saved as well from the sins that they were committing and from the fact that they were away from the Father when they weren't supposed to. With this chapter is how we begin to see Yaakov speak about the blessings that were going to be passed down to his sons. Most importantly, I'm focusing on the blessings passed down to Ephraim and Yosef. And as we will also analyze later on, we will understand that through the blessings that Yaakov gives to his children, 3 are the ones that stand out the most because they have the most important roles or the most important papers to fulfill within the 12 tribes. We see the tribe of Judah, who was the head of all the tribes, as we will see later on, and was also the tribe through which the Messiah was going to come. We see the tribe of the Levites, who were also the ones that were consecrated in service to the Father. And we see finally Joseph, through him we see Ephraim and Manasseh, who bring that multiplication and that fruitfulness of the tribes. So now in this next chapter, chapter 49, we're going to see the blessings that Yaakov gives to his children. It begins by saying, Yaakov called his sons and said to them, "Gather together so that I can tell you what will happen to you in the last days." Now, in this verse, although it says in the last days, it may sound like he's talking about the days before they die or something further on to the future. But he's actually talking about the days that were to come after they were to be liberated from Egypt, entering the land of Canaan, and as well upon the arrival of the Messiah. So during that time period. He continues on by saying, "Be assembled and listen, sons of Yaakov, and listen to Israel your father." So on one hand, he is talking about his sons in the flesh, as he calls himself Yaakov when he says, "Assemble and listen, sons of Yaakov." But on the other hand, he talks about the spiritual blessings he was about to give as Israel, as he says, "Listen to Israel your father." So here we see this separation and this difference that Yaakov makes as to what he is going to be saying next. And he begins with Reuben. We're actually going to see the order of the blessings given based on the order of the firstborn all the way to the youngest. In verses 3 to 4, we see that it's Reuben, and it says, "My firstborn are you, my vigor and firstborn are of my power, endowed with extra dignity, endowed with extra strength." So here I guess we can analyze this and see as if he is actually taking into consideration Reuben and the authority or that paper that he has as the firstborn. But then he continues by saying, "Like water boiling over you will not have extra, for you got up into your father's bed when you defiled a maid's couch." Despite being his firstborn, we see that Reuben is not taken into consideration as the firstborn. So he does not receive that inheritance or that authority, meaning that he won't receive it due to the sin he had committed. And we see that this reference We see this reference that Yaakov is making here in verse 4 in Genesis 35, verse 22, when it says, "While Israel was living in that land, Reuben went and slept with his father's concubine Bilhah, and Israel heard about it." And here we see that Reuben went and he defiled or he slept with a concubine of his father, a maid that was given to him by one of his wives. And we see that that was not something that Reuben was supposed to do, because that was already something that had a connection with his father. And so because of this, that he committed this adultery or this fornication that he did, we see that in the end, he doesn't receive that inheritance. So he doesn't receive what was supposed to be his in the beginning. And that is the consequences of his actions. Continuing on, we see that he begins to talk about Shimeon and Levi, and it says, "They are brothers, instruments of violence are their knives. In their secret council may my soul not enter. In their contingent may my honor never be united. For in their anger they slew men, and in their self-will they maimed oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it was strong, and their rage, for it was cruel. I will disperse them in Yaakov. I will scatter them in Israel." So, when speaking about his sons, Shimeon and Levi, Yaakov calls into memory the event that happened after their sister Dinah was defiled by Hamor. This is something that we have studied previously, and we can find this in Genesis 34, and specifically talking about what Shimeon and Levi did in verse 25, when it says, "Then on the third day, while they were in pain," talking about Hamor and how the people, or all the men there, became circumcised in order for him to receive Dinah as his wife, we see that Dinah's brothers, Shimeon and Levi, each took his sword and came against the city undisturbed and killed every male. So we see these two brothers take their swords, and in order to seek vengeance for their sister, they go and kill every single male. So these two brothers go and kill every single male of a whole city, and it was all due to their anger that they had. And because of their rash and violent behavior, it seems as though Yaakov was exhorting them through his blessing, even though we don't see the Eternal reprehend them after this event. Yet on verse 7, we can know that Yaakov mentions something about each son. So he reprehends them, he is exhorting them, he is calling them out on their behavior that they had, that violence that they took, instead of actually taking this into a more peaceful manner and letting their own emotions get the best of them. We see that at the end there is a smaller blessing or consideration as to what was also going to happen with them. So first we see that it says, "Disperse them in Yaakov." When we go to the Hebrew word, we found it to be chalak, which means to be smooth, apportion, or separate. And with Levi, we see how they were actually separated by the Father to be ministers, the intermediaries between the people and the Father. And we also see afterwards that it says, "I will scatter them in Israel." And the Hebrew word we find here is putz, which means to dash in pieces or to disperse. Now, Shimeon was part of the kingdom of the north, and they were dispersed during the exile during which they became assimilated to the nations. So here we see these characteristics and these events that were eventually going to happen and be fulfilled within Levi and Shimeon or their descendants. And these are the details that we can find in regards to these two brothers. Continuing on, we see that he starts talking about Judah, and it says, "So you are, your brothers will praise you, your hand will be on your enemy's neck, your father's sons will bow down to you." As we begin talking about Judah, we can know how the blessing he receives also coincides with the meaning of his name, which means celebrating, and it comes from a root that means to revere. Not only were they going to be recognized by the other tribes as the head of the people of Israel, but this also represents how the Messiah was going to be recognized by the Israelites in his coming. On the other hand, we can also see a possible allusion to King David, who was given triumph over his enemies by the Eternal, especially when he conquered the land of the Jebusites and consecrated the Mount of Jerusalem as the place where the Eternal was going to manifest his presence. Continuing with Judah, it says, "A lion's cub is Judah. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He crouches, lies down like a lion, or like a lioness. Who would rouse him? The scepter will not pass from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs will come. To him will the obedience of the peoples, binding his foal to the vine, his donkey's colt to the choice vine. He washes his garments in wine, and in the blood of grapes his robe. His eyes are darker than wine, and the teeth that are whiter than milk." So Judah, as I mentioned before, was the head of the people of Israel. And this was a shadow of Yeshua's authority as well that he was going to have over the Israelites. And we see this reflected when he is compared to a lion, talking about Judah, an animal that in this case represents the royalty, hierarchy, strength, and presence of authority. And it's something interesting because I remember at a young age, we usually learn that the king of the jungle is the lion. He is the royal beast, for so to say, in the jungle and here or in the wild, and he is the one that has the authority over the other animals. So we can see how this characteristic of a lion is being represented and showed or demonstrated with Judah. And we also see as well that the Messiah is the king that was established by the Eternal, the one who has authority over all the earth and the heavens, and to whom even the angels bow down in acknowledgement. We see the scepter was not going to pass Judah, as the text says. And this represents the reign that was bestowed upon the tribe since the kings of Israel came from Judah. If we do an analyze, or if we analyze the whole lineage of the kings that came, we will see that they all came from the tribe of Judah. And we also see that the ruler's staff was going to be theirs as well. As we see their staff, we can understand that it was a Torah. In the first century, when the Messiah came, it was the Pharisees and Sadducees who had authority over all of Israel, giving the interpretation of the Torah and establishing laws that they all had to follow, laws that were also a heavy burden and tiresome for the Israelites. And we understand that they had the staff, or they begin sort of demonstrating the staff after the exile, when they all came back together. And we see that in order for them to not fall back into that sin, to not fall back and experience those consequences of being in exile, we see these religious groups start to rise, forming up and rise in order to be more radical and to actually fulfill the Torah step by step. But the problem that came with that was that they became too extreme and too radical, to the point that they started to add their own laws. They started to add their own interpretations and their own understandings, and they started to impose it onto the Israelites so that they would also follow it. And at one point, we understand as well that they listened more to the wise men that they would consider and that they would have as authority, instead of actually analyzing and understanding completely what the Torah actually means and what it actually is, the instruction of the Father, and what he actually wants from them. So this is when we begin to see how they start to demonstrate the staff that they had. And the authority that they had was given to them from the beginning, and from what we see here, as we see prophesied by Yaakov. And it was going to belong to them until he would come. In some versions, we understand that it says until Shiloh would come. And I would like to analyze this word of Shiloh. The word Shiloh in Hebrew means tranquil, and it is an epithet of the Messiah. It also has to do with being sent, as he was sent by the Father. So here we see how the Messiah is referenced, and putting all of these pieces together, we understand that the tribe of Judah was going to have all that authority up until the Messiah, or Shiloh, came, when the rightful heir was going to receive the authority and reign over Israel. And to him would be the authority of the peoples, not just the Israelites, but also the Gentiles, all those who came to be a part of the people that were consecrated to the Eternal. It's important to remember as well that Israel means to triumph, and one becomes part of Israel spiritually as they triumph over the pleasures of the world, dying to their flesh in order to live for their spirit. We see the Messiah take away the authority of the Pharisees and Sadducees in Matthew 21, as he describes the parable of the vineyard, or of the evil tenants, how we see in other versions, where the evil tenants represent the religious leadership in Israel that rejected the message of Teshuvah that the Eternal had sent out with the prophets, and who also rejected the Messiah when he came. In Matthew chapter 21, verse 43 and 45, it says, "Therefore I say to you, the kingdom of Elohim will be taken away from you and given to the people producing its fruits." And verse 45, when the ruling Kohanim and Pharisees heard Yeshua's parables, they realized he was talking about them. The authority that once belonged to them was taken away from them by Yeshua, but it was then given to the emissaries, Yeshua's 12 students, who were always listening attentively, and who were chosen to be judges over the 12 tribes of Israel, so they could produce the fruit of teshuvah within the people that the religious did not produce. In the end of the blessing given to Judah, we continue seeing more possible references of the Messiah, when he enters triumphantly and Jerusalem mounted on a foal of a donkey, as we can see in Matthew chapter 21, verses 1 through 11. And we also see that it's the renewed pact, as mentioned, that was made through his death, represented here by the wine and the, quote, blood of grapes. And we see this specifically in Matthew 26, verses 27 to 28, when he has his meal of Pesach with his disciples. And it says, "And he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave to them, saying, 'Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, of that pact, which is poured out for many for the removal of sins.'" With this, we see the important blessing that Judah had received, and how it was a blessing not just for his tribe, but for all the tribes, and including the Gentiles later on. The next one we will see is Zebulun, who it says will dwell by the seashore and be by a harbor for ships. His distant border reaches Sidon. It is commented that Zebulun was actually good with the matters that had to do with the sea. So they were mariners, I believe. And it was more than likely because they lived in regions close to the water. In the good news of Matthew, we see Yeshua go to the regions of Zebulun and Naphtali in chapter 4, verses 13 to 17, where we can continue seeing that attribute that they had in regards to being near the ocean. In verse 14, we see Issachar, and it says, "It's a strong-boned donkey lying down between two saddlebags. He saw that a resting place was good and that the land was pleasant. He leaned his shoulder to bear a burden and became a forced labor." So here we see this attribute of Issachar that is being compared to that of a donkey. A donkey, as we know, is a humble domestic animal, but it's also an animal that tends to be an animal of service, an animal that is utilized in order to carry and transport heavy things. So in this case, we see that he is compared to a strong-boned donkey who was laying down between two saddlebags. So he saw a resting place and thought that was good. And we see that he is also compared in the aspect that he became a forced laborer. So the blessing of Issachar lets us know that he was good with caring for their cattle, possibly, that he was always taking into consideration the goodness of the land, where it could actually be fruitful, where he could actually have his cattle and grow his crop. And we also see that they were also servants, or a tribe of forced laborers, contrary to the authority and freedom that most of his other brothers would have. In verse 16 to 18, we see Dan, and Dan will judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. "Let Dan be a serpent beside a road, a viper beside a path, who strikes a horse's heels, so that its rider falls backward. For your salvation I wait, Adonai." When we read this portion about Dan, it can be a bit confusing, given that the tribe of Dan wasn't necessarily one that judged the people of Israel. But we can probably think that when Yaakov talks about how they were going to be judges, we can remember the life of Samson, son of Manoah, who was part of the tribe of Dan. As we see in Judges chapter 13, Samson was consecrated from the beginning to be a judge who would deliver the Israelites from the Philistines, and he had the vote of the levirate, meaning he could not drink from the fruit of the vine, nor cut his hair or any hair from his body, and he couldn't touch dead things. On the other hand, coming back to Genesis 49, where Dan is described as a snake, we can understand that this was possibly a betrayal from the tribe of Dan. And we can also see an allusion of this in Judges chapter 14, when Samson kills a lion, which could be an allegorical symbol of the tribe of Judah. As mentioned before, Judah is described as a lion, or he is given that representation of a lion. Yet, when Samson passed that lion again, it had a swarm of bees and honey. And if we analyze the scriptures, we come to see that the Torah, or the instruction of the Father, can be seen described as honey, or even sweeter than honey, like we can find in Proverbs 24, verses 13 to 14. And this scene that we see in the life of Samson can represent how, despite the betrayal that the tribe of Judah was going to receive from Dan, they were going to continue being fruitful, receiving that protection and favor from Elohim, whereas Dan would continue on that same wrong path. At the end, with verse 18, we can confirm that the hope for Dan was not good. And on the contrary, there was no hope in Dan, but the only hope was in Elohim. And we finished with Gad, Asher, and Naphtali, which says, for Gad, it says, attackers will attack him, but he will attack their heels. For Asher, it says, rich is his food, he will provide delicacies fit for a king. And with Naphtali, it says, is a doe let loose, who offers words of beauty. So with Gad, we can see that his tribe would be strong. Even though they were going to be attacked by enemies, in the end, they would triumph. As for Asher, we understand that they were going to be good in agriculture, and from their harvest, they would produce delicious food. And Naphtali, it is commented that they were probably poets, hence the reason why it said that they would offer words of beauty. And we finish this chapter when it says, a fruitful son is Yosef, a fruitful son beside a spring. Daughters walk along a wall. The archers were bitter and shot arrows and were hostile towards him. Yet his bow was always filled, and his arms quick moving, by the hands of the mighty one of Yaakov. From there a shepherd, the stone of Israel. From the Elohim of your father who helps you, the and Shaddai who blesses you, with blessings of heavens above, blessings of the deep that lies below, blessings of breasts and womb. The blessings of your father surpass the blessings of the ancient mountains, the desire of the everlasting hills. May they be upon Joseph's head, about the crown of the one set apart from his brothers. Now with Joseph, we see that Yaakov continues to mention how through him, and speaking specifically about Ephraim, they were going to be fruitful, have a multitude of descendants. But we also see the bitterness that his descendants were going to have as they became sinful, being separated from the eternal, leaving them as well with worry. But despite that sin, they were still going to have the hope of being part of the people through the will and favor of the Father. Their faith was going to be strengthened by the hands of Yaakov, the faith of the patriarchs, and they were going to be shown that favor and strength through the Messiah, the shepherd who came to reunite the lost sheep of Israel and who was the stone of Israel, the cornerstone, the base of the real congregation or Kehillah, raised up by the eternal through him, the one that lives amongst those who believe. And he's also the rock, our foundation, where we need to be established so we don't fall or get destroyed. In Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 to 25, it says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine, here is Yeshua talking after he's given instructions, and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew, all this tribulation that has come, all these problems, and beat against the house, and yet it did not fall, for its foundation had been built on the rock, which is Yeshua. Yosef also had received the blessings from Elohim, blessings of the heavens above, the celestial promise, blessings of the deep that lies below, the resurrection, blessings of breast and womb, fruitfulness, fertility, the number of believers that were going to come. In the end, Yosef received all these blessings and favor of the Father because of his important role as the one who was going to save the Israelites and give them life. The bread that we saw previously and that we see also represented with Yeshua, And because of all he had suffered, being sold by his brothers and then forced to live in a pagan land for many years, without knowing anything about his family. So we see that he receives this favor out of that suffering that he had gone through during all those years. And lastly, I know I mentioned previously that it was going to be the last thing of the chapter, but lastly, in verse 27, now to end actually this blessings that Yaakov is giving, we see that it says, Benjamin is a ravening wolf. So here he's talking about Benjamin. In the morning he devours spoils, and in the evening divides plunder. So in the end, we finish with Benjamin, youngest of them all, and he is described as a wolf. As we have seen throughout this blessing, many of them had been described as animals, as we mentioned with Judah, the lion, and then we saw Issachar with the donkey, and now we're seeing Benjamin as a ravening wolf. And this can possibly be because wolves are described as smart or cunning animals. And as we can see with the tribe of Benjamin, they never left the side of the tribe of Judah. They were always near them. And therefore, they'd benefit as well from the blessings given to Judah. So when Elohim would protect Judah, Benjamin would also receive part in that protection. And we can also see that in the end, that blessing that Benjamin receives from Judah as well can be represented when it says, in the morning he devours spoils. So that leftover, or what is left over from the blessings that Judah receives. So with this, we end this blessings that Israel has given to all of his sons. We see how each son has a different paper within the 12 tribes, how each one has something important described about them, and how they all also seem to reflect a characteristic of each one of his children. So now to actually finalize this chapter, we're going to finalize with the death of Israel. These are the tribes of Israel, 12 in all, and this is what their father spoke to them. He blessed them, each one he blessed with a suitable blessing. So the blessing wasn't just a random blessing or a blessing that was just based out of his own emotions, but it was a blessing that was suitable for each one, something that represented each one. Then he charged them and said to them, I am about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, and that is next to Mamre in the land of Canaan. The field that Abraham bought from Ephron the Hittite is a property for burial. There they buried Abraham and his wife Sarah. There they buried Isaac or Yitzhak and Rebekah, and there I buried Leah. The field was purchased along with the cave in it from the sons of Het. When Yaakov finished commanding his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed, then breathed his last and was gathered to his peoples. So in the end, it seems almost as if Yaakov's words were accounted for, as if he was timed, because soon after he finished speaking all of those words, he died. And this is how chapter 49 ends, with the death of a patriarch. And to conclude and summarize and wrap up our study of today, of these two chapters, I'd like for us to reflect how some of these blessings, if not all, also bless us in our life today. Even though these were given long before we came along, some of these blessings continue to bless us up until today, up until our age, today and age. We see that with Reuben, Shimon, and Levi, we learn actually from these three that whatever decisions we make are going to have consequences. Right now we have this opportunity to serve the Father. We have the opportunity to receive blessings. But if we decide to be rebellious and go against the Father and instead let ourselves be driven by our emotions, driven by our flesh, then we won't be considered to receive that blessing. And we could only be considered actually if we do teshuvah, and if we separate ourselves completely from everything and we live a consecrated life, separating ourselves from the world and everything that it offers to us. So this is what we can learn from Reuben, Shimon, and Levi. The blessings that they received, we see how that can actually help us on our today and age, and how that can help us as well as believers. Then we see Judah. The tribe of Judah received that very important blessing where we see that shadow of the Messiah, the prophetic shadow of the Messiah that was going to come, or that came with authority. And like I mentioned, this wasn't just a blessing for the tribe of Judah. This wasn't just a blessing for the 12 tribes of Israel, but this is a blessing that we also receive up until today. Because of Judah receiving that authority, and because the Eternal made the Israelites persevere and preserve their lineage, preserve that family in order for the Messiah to come pure, we see that the tribe of Judah gives us representation of that authority the Messiah was going to have as that pure son, as that son that actually came from the Father spiritually, as the son that descended and came here as flesh in order for us to have that opportunity to receive that reconciliation with the Father. So this is what we see with the tribe of Judah, the blessing that we have today. And even though we saw as well that the tribe of Judah had authority within the Torah, and given those commandments that they made, man-made commandments and stuff, we understand as well that we're not living under that authority or that religious authority that was presented during that first coming, or during the coming of the Messiah. We don't see ourselves under that authority anymore, but instead we're under the authority of the Messiah. And as the scripture says, the instruction that he gives us is not a heavy burden for us. Instead, it is something that liberates us, which is completely different to what actually came with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who were giving their own interpretation of the law. So with this, we understand how we receive as well up until today this blessing, with the opportunity that we have for this king that actually has redeemed us from our sins, this king that has entered triumphantly before the Father and is now waiting for that moment for him to receive those orders from the Father to come here and take away those who were actually obedient and persevering in their obedience to the eternal Father. And with Joseph, we also learn that there is going to be this multiplication, this fruitfulness that was going to come not only within the people of Israel, as we saw, they were obviously multiplied, but we also see this multiplication within the nations, this opportunity that the nations have to return to the Father, because originally they didn't have this promise. We didn't have this opportunity at first. It was only given for the Israelites. But through Yeshua, we see that we have now this door opened so that we can all come in as well. And so we can all receive this blessing as well, even though we were part of the nations. And this is what we see with his two children, or his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who were children of an Egyptian woman, and yet they were also received by Yaakov in order for them to receive part in that blessing. So even though they were part of the nations, they received part in that blessing and were able to receive also that inheritance that Yaakov had received from the patriarch Abraham. So this is something that has been passed down up until today, up until our days, and it's something that we have to persevere and always strive to keep it, because the moment we become rebellious, then it's something that we can lose, and it's something that we saw with Reuben. And with this, I would like to share Hebrews 8 verse 6, when it says, "But now Yeshua has obtained a more excellent ministry, insofar as he is the mediator of a better pact, or a better covenant, or a better promise, which has been enacted on better promises." So here we see this blessing that we now receive with Yeshua, who has come here and has given us this opportunity to receive this promise, to be part of this new and better covenant, this new and better pact with the Eternal. And also Hebrews chapter 10 verse 23, when it says, "Let us hold fast the unwavering confession of hope, for he who promised is faithful." We must strive every single day in order to keep this promise that we have been given, keep this opportunity that we have been given, so that we don't lose it. And with this, we conclude our video. Thank you for allowing us to be part of your study of the Torah. It is a great blessing for us. And we ask if you could please give us a like or a thumbs up so this video can also reach others. And you can also comment if you have any questions about this study. And you can share the video as well. Once again, thank you so much for accompanying us today, and we hope that we see you next time if the Father wills. Blessings and shalom.